The weight of a promise. He'd been sending money to a dead woman's husband for 3 years, until the day he answered the door and found her standing there, alive. Daniel Mercer had a system. Every first of the month, without fail, without question, without the kind of hesitation that might crack open the grief he'd spent 3 years carefully sealing shut, he logged into his bank account, moved his thumb to the transfer button, and sent $750 to Marcus Webb, his son-in-law, the man his daughter Sophie had loved more than she'd ever loved anything, including, Daniel sometimes thought with a faint and harmless jealousy, himself. It wasn't a legal obligation. No court had ordered it. No document required it. It was simply the thing he had decided to do on the night of the funeral, standing in the kitchen of his daughter's house while everyone else sat in the living room with their casseroles and their condolences. And Marcus had leaned against the counter with a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking and said, in a voice so hollow it barely qualified as a voice, "I don't know how I'm going to keep the house." Dan, she handled all of that. Daniel had looked at this young man, 31 years old, a high school art teacher, a person whose primary skill in the world was helping 14-year-olds understand perspective, and he had said, "Don't worry about the house," just that, 4 words, and then he'd gone back to the living room and eaten a piece of dry pound cake and shaken the hands of people whose names he couldn't remember the next morning. And the month after Sophie died, he set up the automatic transfer, and that was that. $750. It was a number he'd arrived at through a kind of arithmetic of grief, enough to cover the difference between what Marcus earned and what the mortgage required, leaving a small cushion for utilities and the ordinary disasters of homeownership. Not so much that it felt like charity, not so little that it felt like gesture. Sophie would have done the same. That was the thought that accompanied every transfer. Every first of the month, like a small prayer he didn't quite believe in anymore, Sophie would have done the same. He was 63 years old and retired, 27 years as a structural engineer with the State Department of Transportation, overseeing the construction and maintenance of bridges. There was something almost too on the nose about that. His colleagues had noted at his retirement party, a man who spent his entire career making sure things didn't fall down, spending his final years dealing with the spectacular collapse of his own personal world. His wife Patricia had died 6 years ago, ovarian cancer diagnosed in March gone by. October, the speed of it still struck him as indecent. You didn't get to say all the things you needed to say. You barely got to say goodbye before goodbye became the whole conversation. Then Sophie, 3 years ago, a car accident on a Wednesday afternoon in November, the kind of ordinary catastrophe that happens every day in every city in the world. A driver running a red light, the wrong intersection, the wrong second. She'd been 34. She and Marcus had been talking about having children. They'd been saving for it, that careful, deliberate saving of 2 people who wanted to do everything right. Now it was just Daniel in the house on Alderman Street, a 4-bedroom colonial that had once been full. Patricia's cooking smells, Sophie's teenage music, the organized chaos of a family, and was now, in his most honest moments, simply a very large container for one old man's memories. He walked every morning, he read, he played chess online against strangers who never said anything and won about 40% of the time, which he found oddly comforting. He had dinner every Thursday with his friend Howard, who'd retired from the same department 2 years before Daniel and who had the good grace to never try to fix Daniel's sadness, only to sit companionably beside it over pasta and a glass of wine. He did not date. People had suggested it in that delicate sideways way people suggest things they know will be poorly received. His sister Margaret had once mentioned a woman from her church. Howard had once memorably said, "You're not dead, Dan," which was the most direct anyone had gotten, and which Daniel had answered with the particular silence that ended conversations. He wasn't interested. That wasn't quite right. He was capable of interest. He knew that. He wasn't broken in that way. He simply had no appetite for it. Patricia had been the only person he'd ever entirely trusted, and the thought of building that kind of trust again from scratch, of doing all that vulnerable, terrifying work of letting someone into the interior of yourself, struck him as a task he'd already completed. He'd done it once and beautifully, and it was finished. So he walked and read and played chess, and sent money on the first of the month and called his sister on Sundays, and this was his life. And he was, if not happy exactly, then at least stable, a structure sound enough to bear the load. He hadn't spoken to Marcus in almost 8 months. That was a recent development. For the first 2 years after Sophie died, they'd had something. Not quite a relationship, more like a shared custody arrangement with Grief. They'd met for lunch occasionally, texted on Sophie's birthday and on the anniversary of the accident. Marcus had come to Daniel's house for Thanksgiving the first year, and they'd cooked together in uncomfortable silence and watched football and cried separately, in different rooms, and that had been oddly all right. But then something shifted. Gradually, the way things gradually shift, Marcus began responding to texts more slowly and then inconsistently and then occasionally not at all. The lunch invitations went from regular to sporadic to stopped. Daniel had last seen him in person 11 months ago at a coffee shop, and Marcus had seemed different, not grieving differently, not the ordinary evolution of grief Daniel might have expected, but differently, distracted, almost agitated. He'd cut the coffee short, claimed a commitment he hadn't mentioned before, and hugged Daniel in a way that felt like the hug was also a goodbye. Daniel had told himself it was part of healing, that Marcus was moving on, building a new life, that this distance was healthy and normal and what Sophie would have wanted for him. He told himself this on the first of every month as he pressed the transfer button. It wasn't the money he missed, obviously. He didn't need the money. He was 63 and childless now, and there was a certain grim freedom in having nothing left to save up for. What he missed, he admitted to himself sometimes, late at night in the too large house, was the last living connection to his daughter. Marcus was the person who'd woken up next to her, who'd heard her laugh in real time, in physical space, who carried inside him thousands of small private stories about Sophie that Daniel would never know and could never access, and that would disappear when Marcus eventually, inevitably, moved on entirely. He sent the money anyway. It was a Tuesday in February, the 5th, which was a few days past the 1st, but he'd been distracted by a situation with a burst pipe in the basement when his phone rang, and the number was one he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. He almost let it go to voicemail the way he did with most unrecognized numbers, with their solar panel offers and their warranty extension scams. But something about the area code nagged at him, his own area code, local, and he picked up. Hello. Silence on the other end, then breathing, then a sound he could not immediately categorize. Something between a gasp and a swallow. Hello, he said again. Dad. The word hit him like a physical thing, not like a blow, softer than that, like a wave, the kind that doesn't knock you down but gets into your shoes and thoroughly undoes you anyway. His first thought, embarrassingly, was that he'd misheard. His second thought was that he was losing his mind, which he'd wondered about occasionally in a distant academic way. His third thought came alongside a sound in his chest he hadn't made in 3 years. Who is this? He said, and his voice sounded nothing like his voice. "It's me," a pause, "it's Sophie." He drove to the address she gave him without remembering the drive. He would think about this later, the 40 minutes between hanging up the phone and knocking on the door of the apartment building on Curtis Avenue and find it essentially blank. He had no memory of getting his keys, of backing out of the driveway, of the specific route he must have taken because there were only two logical routes. He had no memory of parking, though his car was clearly parked when he arrived. The 40 minutes had simply erased themselves, as if his brain had decided there were more important things to allocate resources to. The building was a 5-story brick structure that had once been something more distinguished. The bones of it suggested aspiration, the high windows and the corniced roofline, but had settled into respectability, a middle place, modest but not rough, the kind of building where people got on with things. He stood at the intercom and pressed the button for apartment 4C. "Come up," said the voice that was her voice. The elevator was slow. He took the stairs. She was standing in the doorway when he reached the 4th floor, and his brain, which had been performing remarkable acrobatics of denial and bargaining for the past 40 minutes, gave up entirely. It was Sophie, 37 now, where he'd last seen her at 34, and he could see the 3 years in her face, not aging exactly but settling. She was thinner than he remembered. Her hair was shorter, cut practically to the jaw, where she'd always worn it long before. She was wearing jeans and a gray sweater, and she had both arms crossed over her chest, and she was crying. Before he even reached her, he didn't say anything. He wasn't capable of it. He walked to her and put his arms around her, and felt her actually there, weight and warmth and the particular smell of her, which was still impossibly the same, and he cried in a way he hadn't cried since Patricia's funeral, the kind of crying that has no dignity and needs none. They stood in the doorway of apartment 4C for a long time. Her name was still Sophie. That was one of the first things she said, as if she understood the disorientation of his situation and wanted to give him landmarks. "My name is still Sophie. I'm okay, I'm healthy, I'm so sorry, Dad." She made tea. He sat at her kitchen table and watched her make it and cataloged everything about her, the way you catalog something you thought you'd lost forever, the way she reached for cups on her tiptoes even though she could have reached flat-footed, the way she held the kettle slightly to the left of center, small muscular memories of a person, the body's own autobiography. "You have to start from the beginning," he said. His voice had returned more or less. It had taken most of the tea. She sat across from him and put her hands around her own mug and told him there had been an accident. That much was real. There had been a genuine accident on that November Wednesday at that intersection, but Sophie had not died in it. She had been unconscious, badly injured, taken to Mercy General under a misidentification that she still didn't entirely understand the mechanism of, some confusion with another victim, a clerical error, compounded by the chaos of a multi-car pileup on the same evening. She'd spent 11 days in a medically induced coma. When she woke up, she had no identification. The car had been leased under a company name. Her phone had been destroyed. This was where the story got harder to tell, and Daniel watched her face as she told it, trying to understand what was underneath the words. When she'd recovered enough to speak, she had not immediately called Marcus. She had not called Daniel. She had lain in the hospital bed in a room that didn't know who she was, and she had thought for the first time with real clarity about the life she'd been living. She and Marcus had not been doing well. Daniel hadn't known this. Sophie hadn't told him, because she'd inherited Patricia's stubborn privacy about marriages, the sense that what happened between husband and wife stayed there, but they had not been doing well for more Then a year before the accident, not a dramatic collapse, nothing with violence or betrayal, but a quiet, terrible erosion. Two people who had loved each other very much discovering that they had become somehow strangers who shared space. She had been, she said, deeply unhappy. She had been trying to figure out how to leave without destroying Marcus, who was sensitive and who loved her completely, which was somehow part of the problem and not the solution. And then the accident happened, she said, and I woke up and no one knew I was alive and I. She stopped. I know how this sounds. Tell me anyway, Daniel said. I thought about not coming back. She said it to her mug. I thought, this is a door that opened. I didn't open it, but it opened, and I could walk through it and become someone else, someone who wasn't trapped in a life that had slowly become a room with no air, and I could stop hurting Marcus with my presence the way I'd been hurting him, by not being able to love him back the way he needed. That was how I thought about it. I could spare him by letting him think you were dead. Yes. The words sat between them for a long moment. And you knew, he said, you knew what it would do to me. Her face broke. Yes. He sat with that. 3 years of it. 3 years of walking around the house on Alderman Street, in the particular silence of a man with nothing left to lose. 3 years of first of the month transfers and Thursday dinners and chess games, and the sense that the world had been drained of something fundamental and irreplaceable. Why now, he asked. What changed? She looked up at him. I've been trying to come back for a year. I kept getting close and then I couldn't figure out how to explain it. There's no good way to explain this. I knew that whatever I said would be inadequate. She paused, and then I heard someone told me that Marcus was going to sell the house, and I thought about the money, what you've been paying every month for 3 years, and I thought about you in that house by yourself, sending money to a man you barely talk to anymore because you made a promise and you keep promises, and I couldn't. Her voice broke. I couldn't let you do that anymore without knowing why. There was no clean resolution. Daniel had learned enough in 63 years to know that clean resolutions were a fiction, that the messy human stuff, the actual substance of lives, didn't resolve, it evolved. What was done. Sophie had made a choice that had cost him 3 years of grief so profound, he'd sometimes wondered if he would simply wear out from it like a material stressed past its yield point. That was real, and it couldn't be unreal, and she knew it, and he knew it, and no amount of tea or honesty could change the atomic fact of it. But she was alive. She was sitting across from him in apartment 4C on Curtis Avenue, 37 years old, thinner and shorter-haired and more tired-looking than he remembered, and she was alive. His daughter, who he had buried, not literally. They'd had a memorial without remains, a strange, untethered ceremony that had felt incomplete in a way he now understood, was alive and reachable and in his arms again. He stayed for 4 hours. She told him about the 3 years. She had moved to a different city, initially Portland, Oregon, under a different name, working as a freelance graphic designer, building a life that was genuinely hers in a way her previous life hadn't been for a long time. She had done therapy, enormous amounts of therapy. She had dated someone briefly, a kind and uncomplicated man named James, who had not worked out but had not hurt her either. She had, she said, become someone she recognized. And Marcus, Daniel asked, he'd been careful about this, circling it. I don't know, she said. I haven't contacted him. I don't know if I will. That's something I have to figure out. He mourned you, Daniel said. He said it without accusation, just as a fact to be placed on the table. I know. For 3 years. I know, Dad. He nodded. He looked at his hands, the hands that had built bridges, metaphorically and otherwise, the hands that had written $750 every first of the month for 36 months. He doesn't know, he said. He still thinks you're dead. Yes. I'm going to have to. What do you want me to do with this? Am I supposed to keep this from him? She was quiet for a long time. The apartment made small sounds around them, the radiator, neighbor's television, the street below. No, she said finally, you shouldn't have to keep this. That's not fair to you, it never was. She looked at him directly. I'll tell him, I'll figure out how to. Tell him, just give me a little time. How much time? Not 3 years, she said. It might have been a joke, but neither of them laughed. He drove home in the dark, through streets wet with the beginning of February rain, and he sat in his car in the driveway for a long time before going inside. The house felt different when he entered it. The same 4 bedrooms, the same smell of his own habitation, the same furniture Patricia had chosen, and that he'd never felt entitled to change. But something had shifted in the air of it, some quality that he couldn't name precisely, but that he recognized as the opposite of the feeling he'd been living with for 3 years, the opposite of final. He thought about Marcus. He thought about the house Sophie and Marcus had shared, the house Daniel had been helping to maintain, unwittingly, in the memory of a woman who wasn't dead. He thought about the complexity of this, the legal complexity, the emotional complexity, the sheer human tangle of it. Marcus had presumably begun to rebuild. Marcus had pulled back from Daniel, had maybe found other sources of support, other reasons to move forward. And now this. He thought, who gets to decide when a story is over? He'd believed his story with Sophie was over, finished, sealed, the way you seal off a structural failure. You shore it up, you prevent further collapse, you learn to work around what you've lost. He'd spent 3 years doing that careful, exhausting work, and now the very foundation of the loss was different than he'd understood it to be. He wasn't sure, sitting in his dark hallway with his coat still on, whether he was angry. He tested it the way you test a weight-bearing surface before you put your full trust in it. There was anger. There he could feel it, a genuine deep anger at the cost of her choice, at the years and the grief and the particular loneliness of being a man who has outlived everyone who knew him when he was young, but underneath the anger, or beside it, or threaded through it in a way that made separation impossible, there was something so vast and formless that his structural engineer's brain had no category for it. His daughter was alive. After a while, he took off his coat and hung it up and went to the kitchen and made himself a bowl of soup from a can, which was what he ate when he couldn't think about food, and he stood at the counter and ate it and looked out at the dark, wet garden. He picked up his phone. He held it for a long time, then he called Howard. I need to tell you something, he said when Howard answered. Okay, said Howard, who understood the weight of those words from Daniel and gave them the respect they deserved. I don't know how to say this. Start anywhere, Howard said. Daniel thought about where to start. He thought about the first of the month, about the automatic transfer, about the promise made in a kitchen while everyone else was eating pound cake. He thought about all the bridges he'd built over all the years, the spans and the supports and the careful calculus of load and counterload, the engineering of survival. My daughter called me today, he said. Silence on the other end, then Sophie. Yes. Howard was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was very careful, the way voices get when they're not sure what they're dealing with. Dan. She's alive, Daniel said. She's been alive for 3 years. She lives on Curtis Avenue. I had tea with her this afternoon. Another long silence. Then Howard said, I'm coming over. You don't have to. I'm coming over, Howard said and hung up. Howard came and they sat in Daniel's living room until nearly midnight, and Daniel told the Whole story, and Howard listened the way good friends listen, not trying to fix it or frame it or arrive at useful conclusions, just receiving it, which was the thing Daniel needed. Near midnight, Howard said, "What are you going to do?" "About Marcus." "About all of it." Daniel looked at the fireplace, which he never used because starting fires alone had always seemed pointlessly theatrical. "I'm going to let her tell him," he said. "I'll give her time to do that. A real deadline, not open-ended. She owes him that conversation and she knows it. And if she doesn't, then I will." He said it without drama, because Marcus has been living inside a grief that isn't true, and that's not, you can't leave someone in that. Whatever Sophie needed, whatever the reasons were, you can't leave a person inside a false grief forever. Howard nodded slowly. "And you, what do you do with this?" Daniel thought about the $750. He thought about the transfer, the first of every month, the small ritual of it. He thought about what that money had meant, not to Marcus, perhaps not to the mortgage, but to him, the doing of it, the promise kept, the way it had been in the absence of everything else, a way of maintaining continuity with the person he'd been when Sophie was alive, a father who took care of his family, who showed up, who built the spans and maintained the load. "I don't know yet," he said, which was honest. Sophie called Marcus 2 weeks later. She told Daniel about it afterward, in a long and fractured phone call that covered ground they didn't have the framework for and had to build as they went. Marcus had listened. He had not spoken for a very long time. He had asked 2 questions: "Where have you been, and did you know what it would do to me?" And she had answered both honestly, and then there had been a silence on the phone so profound, she'd thought the call had dropped. "What did he say?" Daniel asked. "He said he needed time," Sophie said. "That's all, he said he needed time." "That's fair." "I know." "Are you going to?" He stopped, recalibrated. "Do you want to reconcile with him?" She was quiet. "I don't know," she said. "I don't think so. I think what we had was, I think it was real, and I think it was over before the accident, and I think the accident just made visible what was already true." A pause. "But I caused him a tremendous amount of pain, and I have to sit with that regardless of what we decide. That's not going away." "No." Daniel agreed. "It isn't." He thought about the transfer. He'd stopped it the 1st of March, canceled the automatic payment because the reason for it had changed in a way he was still processing. He'd also sent Marcus a message, brief and careful, saying only that he'd learned some new information, that Sophie would be reaching out, that he was sorry for the upheaval. Marcus had not replied, and Daniel understood that and left it. "Dad," Sophie said. "Yes." "I'm sorry about the money, that you spent that on a situation that was." "Don't," he said, not harshly, just firmly. "Don't apologize for the money. That's not what I'm owed." She was quiet. "What I'm owed," he said, "is time. I want Sundays, and I want you to come to dinner, and I want you to meet Howard eventually, who has been the only real company I've had for 3 years, and who deserves to meet the person responsible for half my conversation topics." He heard something in her breathing that might have been a laugh. "I want to learn who you are now," he said. 37-year-old Sophie, short hair, Portland. Years, therapy, the whole thing. I want to know her." "Okay," she said. Her voice was thick. "And I'm going to be angry sometimes. I'm telling you that up front. Not all the time, but sometimes. There are going to be moments when it comes up and I'm going to need to say so." "I know. You have to let me do that." "I know, Dad, I will." The first Sunday she came to Alderman Street, she stood in the front hallway for a long time and just looked. He watched her do it, cataloging the house the way he'd cataloged her in Apartment 4C, taking inventory of what remained and what had changed and what it meant. She walked to the bookshelf in the living room and found a photograph of Patricia, a good one from a camping trip to the Adirondacks, Patricia laughing at something off-frame, the mountains behind her. Sophie picked it up and held it with both hands. "I missed her," she said. "I know. When I was gone, I thought about her. I thought about both of you, constantly." She set the photo down carefully. "That's something I have to live with too." "Yes," Daniel said. He said it without softening. He'd made roast chicken, Patricia's recipe, the one he'd finally learned in the years of cooking. For one, he'd set the table for two with the good plates because Sophie coming to dinner was an occasion, would always now be an occasion, and he wasn't going to waste it on ordinary plates. They ate and they talked carefully at first, the way you navigate new old territory, watching for the soft spots, and then less carefully, and then the way they'd once talked with the ease of people who'd sat across from each other at tables for decades and had the accumulated grammar of each other. She told him about Portland, about the design work, about a friend named Clara who'd become her closest person through the long, strange years of reinvention, about the therapy, the particular work of it, the way she'd had to dismantle herself and rebuild from different materials. He told her about the bridges, about the one he'd overseen last, Route 84, the Farmington River crossing, a replacement structure that he'd been part of from the ground up, and that still struck him when he drove past it as one of the more quietly beautiful things he'd been part of. He told her about Howard, about the chess, about how he'd taken up cooking with something approaching seriousness in the past year, the way you take up things when you're trying to fill time with meaning. After dinner, they washed up together, standing side by side at the sink the way they'd done when she was a teenager, and the domesticity of it, the ordinary, unremarkable, specific domesticity of a father and daughter washing dishes, was so enormous that Daniel had to look out the window for a moment and breathe through it. "Same time next week?" he asked when she was leaving. "Yes," she said. She hugged him at the door, long and without hurry. "Same time next week." He did not restart the transfer. He had thought about it in the early weeks. While things were still unclear, he'd wondered if some version of it made sense, if there was an obligation that survived the changed circumstances. But no, the transfer had been for a specific reason in a specific context, and that context had changed beyond recognition. Marcus was not his son-in-law in the way he'd been. He was a man in pain, working through a revelation that beggared ordinary pain, and Daniel felt for him with a genuine ache. But the monthly check had been for Sophie's memory, and Sophie was no longer a memory. What he sent instead, 3 months later, was a letter. He'd written it by hand, which he hadn't done in years, and mailed it to the house. He wasn't sure Marcus would open it, or read it, or reply, but he wrote it because some things need to be said, even when the outcome is uncertain. He wrote, "I know there is nothing adequate to say about what happened. I know that you are carrying something I can't take from you and wouldn't presume to. What I can tell you is that she is well. She has done serious work on herself, and she knows the cost of her choices. I don't ask you to forgive her. I don't ask you to do anything. I only wanted you to know from me that she is not a ghost. She is a person in the world, and for what it's worth, my time with you in those years when we were both finding our way was real. You were good to her. You were good to me. I'm grateful for that, whatever comes next." He didn't sign it Dad, which would have been presumptuous. He signed it Daniel Mercer, which was enough. 3 months later, Marcus replied. A short message, digital, careful in the way of someone who had drafted and redrafted. He thanked Daniel for the letter. He said he was in therapy, that it was going slowly, that some days were better than others. He said he was not ready to speak to Sophie, and he didn't know if he ever would be, and he needed that to be okay. I don't hold you responsible, he wrote. I want you to know that. Whatever she chose, you were. In the dark, same as me. Daniel read the message on his phone on a Thursday morning, standing in his kitchen with his coffee, the February light coming through the window at the angle it came through every February morning. He read it twice. Then he set the phone down and drank his coffee and looked at the garden, which was bare and patient and waiting for spring. He thought about structures, about the engineering of them, the way a bridge is not one thing, but thousands of decisions, each load-bearing in its way, each dependent on the others. The way a structure survives not by being rigid, but by being designed for movement, accounting for wind and temperature, and the 10,000 small forces that act on it from every direction. He had spent 63 years building things that were meant to last. He had learned mostly through Patricia and partly through Sophie, and the rest through simply being alive that long that the things worth building were never the ones that resisted all change. They were the ones that accommodated it, that bent slightly in the places they were designed to bend and held in the places they were designed to hold. He picked up his phone and texted Howard, "Dinner tonight, I have news." Howard replied in under a minute, "Always." Outside on Alderman Street, the February morning continued its unremarkable progress. Cars moved past. A dog went by with its owner, nose down and purposeful. A delivery truck parked briefly and departed. The ordinary life of an ordinary street, full of houses containing lives that were, each of them, as complicated and unlikely as his own. Daniel Mercer rinsed his coffee cup, put it in the drying rack, and went upstairs to get his coat. He had things to do. His daughter was alive, and the work of learning who she was continued, and there were dinners to cook and letters to write and bridges to maintain, and the morning was still young. And he was still here, and that, after everything, after 3 years of first-of-the-month grief, and chess games and conversations that stopped just short of the thing he really needed to say. That, he had decided, was enough to go on with. More than enough. And